With U.S. President-elect Donald Trump threatening to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, China is ready to lead global climate efforts. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It was just 1 year ago when the United States and China pledged to lead the fight against climate change at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris. But what a difference a year makes. Come January, Donald Trump is set to become the next president of the United States. An outspoken climate change skeptic, Mr. Trump is threatening to pull out of the Paris Accord when he takes office. For its part, China has made clear it intends to move ahead with or without the United States. We get more now from CCTV's Xiao Lingfeng in Beijing. And Lingfeng, President-elect Trump says the science of climate change remains an open question. Nobody knows if it's real. In the past, he's called it a hoax invented by China. What's Beijing's reaction to Mr. Trump's skepticism?
Well, and China's top climate change negotiator, who's also Vice Foreign Minister Liu Jianming, rejected Donald Trump's view during the climate change talks held in Morocco last month. He said China could not have invented global warming as a hoax, given that it was Donald Trump's Republican predecessors, namely the Reagan and the senior Bush administration, who started climate negotiations in the 1980s. That was even before China knew that talks to reduce pollution were starting. And prior to Liu's comment, President Xi Jinping had underlined the importance of cooperation between China and the U.S. when he spoke to Donald Trump after the U.S. election. President Xi said China is expecting that developed countries, including the U.S., will continue to lead the way in mitigating climate change, but she also stressed that China will continue its own fight against climate change, whatever the circumstances. And the Chinese negotiators have also said they will stick to initiatives here at home to curb emissions and expand cooperation with developing countries to combat global warming.
Now, China has taken the lead in global renewable investment and is on track at cutting CO2 emissions further. Give us a few examples of what China is doing to reduce greenhouse gases and make the move towards a low-carbon future.
China has been the world's top investor in renewable energy 4 years in a row. Last year, it spent $111 billion into the sector. That's a third of the world's total, nearly the combined total of the U.S. and Europe. Meanwhile, China also led the world in installed wind power, solar power, and hydropower with a total renewable capacity of 500 gigawatts, compared with 220 gigawatts by the U.S. It's therefore no surprise to hear that China is currently the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of both wind turbines and solar panels. Though the country remains very dependent on coal, it is cutting its fossil fuel emissions output by 0.5% this year versus 0.7% in 2015. And next year, Beijing is poised to open a nationwide carbon emissions trading program. When completed, it will be the biggest in the world. With all these efforts together, China is pushing very hard on its agenda to see its carbon emissions peak by 2030 as part of its national commitments to the Paris Agreement. Back to you, Anand.
Thanks, Lingfeng. That's CCTV's Xiao Lingfeng reporting from Beijing. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from New Delhi is Arunabha Ghosh. He's the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a leading South Asia policy research organization. With us here in Washington is Ma Tianji. He's the Beijing managing editor for China Dialogue, an independent website focusing on environmental issues. Andrew Light is a distinguished senior fellow in the Global Climate Program at the World Resources Institute. And joining us from New York is Barbara Fenimore. She is the senior attorney and Asia director for the China Program at the National Resources Defense Council. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Barbara, let me start with you. Given the threat by President-elect Donald Trump to pull out of the Paris Accord, what kind of challenge will that pose for a country like China, which has said that it will now have to take the lead in combating climate change?
Well, China has said that it is committed to moving ahead with climate change, regardless of what the United States does, that it is in the best interests of world leaders to follow global trends, which are to move towards clean energy. And China is responsible for over a quarter of total global greenhouse gas emissions and really holds the key to the future of our global climate. So it's going to be challenging for China now that the United States at least has said in principle that they will reconsider the Paris Agreement. We will wait and see about that. The U.S. is going to move ahead, actually, regardless of what happens in Washington, because of the strong programs that are going on, will continue to go on in states and cities. Nonetheless, it's going to be really incumbent on China to take that leadership role because that's the future of our planet.
Andrew, President-elect Trump has nominated a number of climate change skeptics to his administration. There are reports also that he will nominate Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, who is a leading climate change denier, to his administration as energy secretary. In all, there are 9 senior members of the transition team who are skeptics. What does this tell you about where the United States is going? I mean, is it going to pull out of all climate change efforts?
We don't know yet. We don't know where they're going. Donald Trump has also said he's considering and looking into the issue. I think it's in some respects, we need to wait and sort of see what the administration is going to do, but at the same time be very prepared, given who they are staffing up within the administration at the cabinet level and lower down for an onslaught, for a big push both against the domestic regulations that President Obama has put in place that allow us to reduce our emissions and meet the commitments that we've put out under the Paris Agreement, and also to continue to defend really the importance, the viability of the Paris Agreement itself and why the United States should remain in it. So we've got to remain, I think, vigilant just because of the profile of the people that he has put in place.
Tianji, Chinese officials have made it clear that China will pursue its own interests for a low-carbon future. What is your view on this? I mean, how big a challenge is it going to be for Beijing?
I think currently the Chinese climate policy is driven largely by domestic concerns. So I would consider some of the key policies robust with a high level of public support and also a commitment from top leadership. For example, we all know that China is now very much concerned with the air pollution situation. So a move away from fossil fuel sources such as coal as a primary energy source would actually solve and reduce air pollution, but at the same time actually reduce China's carbon emissions. So the Chinese government, the top leadership has made commitments through their 13th five-year plan, which is the blueprint for the next 5 years of the country's socio-economic issues, and has embedded a lot of the key elements of its climate policy in that kind of high-level government plan. So I would think that China is on the right trajectory to move the country towards a low-carbon future.
Arunaba, how damaging would it be if the United States does indeed pull out of the Paris Accord?
From a global perspective, of course, it's damaging because the Paris Agreement is a capstone of about 25 years of negotiations that brings every country, rich or poor, small or big, around the table, and every country coming and saying that we are going to do something about it. Now, obviously, what countries have committed so far is not sufficient to keep us under 2 degrees, but it's a significant step forward from what we had going on in the past. So if the world's largest historical emitter and the current second largest emitter pulls out, then obviously it sends a different signal altogether of what global collective action means. But on the ground, is it damaging? I'm not sure. Because, just like China has its own interests, India has its own interests as well. Whether it's energy access, energy security, energy efficiency, we see value in a cleaner energy transition, even as we temporarily get onto a cleaner coal path and then natural gas, even as we build out one of the largest and most dynamic renewable energy markets. So there is an internal logic to this. There is a market dynamic to this. There is a technological shift that's going on, none of which can be denied, whether you deny climate science or not. So I think the United States has to ask itself the question, that what signal does it want to send? Is it only a signal about multilateral negotiations, or is it also denying the way energy markets are moving? And if it's denying that, then it's losing out on business opportunities that other countries like China and India might grab.
Barbara, on the question of what signal the United States wants to send, Donald Trump has described climate change as a hoax which has been perpetrated by the Chinese for economic advantages. China has, of course, denied this. But Is this an indication of where he's going here? He's going to put business and the business of making money above climate change.
Donald Trump has said that he wants to move back to the coal use, oil use of the 19th century, claiming that that will create millions of jobs and raise income. But the fact of the matter is coal use is declining in the United States. Utilities, states and cities realize that they have to move ahead if they want to create jobs, if they want to have a sustainable economy. They have to move to the clean energy of the 21st century. So if Donald Trump really wants to make America great again, he will not choose to opt out of the clean energy revolution, which is going to move ahead because the markets demand it, because utilities are making long-term investments recognizing that carbon is going to be regulated, needs to be regulated. They are shutting down coal plants. They're not going to open them up again. But the way of the future is really what China is doing, is trying to transition away from its dependence on coal towards clean energy and using its funding to create jobs, to help workers make that transition to clean energy jobs, which are numerous. China actually leads the world right now in clean jobs on renewable energy, about 3.5 million jobs. That's the way for the United States to go as well.
Andrew, those targets that they talked about in the Paris Accord, keeping the rise in temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, what happens if the U.S. pulls out to those targets?
Well, the U.S. alone is not going to completely derail hitting those targets, but it does depend on what is the impact. If the U.S. pulls out, first of all, if the U.S. dismantles our domestic regulations that are right now the thing that are really keeping us moving in the right direction, along with the business environment that it's set, completely agree with all of that. But if this does have a follow-on effect on other countries, that they start reducing their targets as well or reducing their ambition, then we could potentially be seeing a cascading effect, which could be quite damaging. Now, I personally think that what's going to happen is that given what states and cities are doing and what the business environment is in the United States, the growth of renewable energy jobs, the direction of travel, that the United States will still probably hit maybe the low end of its target for 2025 that it's put into the Paris Agreement, no matter what the new incoming administration does. I think it does put us in a very bad place, though, for increasing our ambition, say by 2030, to get to even greater reductions, or indeed achieving an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, which is what the current White House has said that's what we should do, and as you recently released a report during the last UN climate negotiations just a few weeks ago on what the pathway for that would be, which just means that it's going to be more expensive for the U.S. to eventually catch up when we get back into the game. And again, that could have some kind of effect on the rest of the world. I hope not. But I hope Arunabe is right about this. The other countries will see that it is in their self-interest, their best interest, to continue moving forward in the way that they have said that they would.
Right. Tianji, Donald Trump seems to come at this issue from a point of it's either economic growth or combating climate change. It's an either-or situation. It doesn't have to be. China has shown that it can be both, can't it?
Exactly. I think China is a very good example of showing how its environmental goals can be aligned with economic goals, right? China is currently trying to figure out ways to move away from its reliance on heavy industry in infrastructure investment as an engine of economic growth. And you're seeing big progress in that aspect in recent years, where the percentage of service as a contribution to the general growth of the economy is significant. We're seeing a decoupling, for example, of energy use and economic growth. We are still seeing over 6% of annual economic growth, but with a flat or a much reduced reliance on energy and electricity consumption, which shows that you can actually decouple carbon emissions from economic growth.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
China has shown its very responsible attitude in the face of climate change. We are very willing to share our experience on coping with climate change with all countries, especially developing countries.
That was China's Special Representative for Climate Change, Xi Zhenhua, speaking at last month's climate conference in Morocco. Welcome back. We're talking about China's leading role in combating global climate change. Let's go to Arunaba in New Delhi. And Arunaba, the United States says that its investment in new energy technologies will decrease. And I've got two parts to this question. One is, what does that do for climate change efforts? And two, does it actually give China the opportunity to take the lead in developing new technologies?
China has already been trying to grab that opportunity. In its 12th five-year plan, it had identified 7 new strategic emerging industries, 3 of which were around electric vehicles, clean energy production, alternative technologies, and the others also had some role or the other to play with a clean tech transition. Its 13th five-year plan embeds those ideas even further. So China does not see it only from the perspective of, let's save the planet or let's hug a tree. It sees an economic opportunity in these new technologies. Now, compared to that, what happens going forward if the United States decreases investment in clean energy? One, it does cede market share to a growing Chinese juggernaut in this area. Number two, it actually denies or turns a blind eye to a global value chain or a global supply chain on clean energy and other clean technologies, where all of the major countries could have a stake in the pie. Number three, even more importantly, I think, looking a little more into the future, is the role of energy R&D. Mission innovation was announced by the United States along with 20 other countries on the first day of the Paris Conference of the Parties. On the same day, India and France came forward and announced the International Solar Alliance. All of these new platforms had a component of investment, collaborative investment in energy R&D. Now, if you reduce that on one side of the equation, it requires the others to step up, but it also means you're not taking part in those new opportunities that are going to get created. So whether it's jobs, whether it's new technologies, whether it's new sources of finance, whether it is the global supply chain, the United States risks losing out a lot by denying climate science, but also denying all of these other trends. And China is already trying to grab this opportunity, and India is trying to get onto that bandwagon as well. 175,000 megawatts of clean energy by 2022 is India's target. That's transformational. So which part of the story does the United States want to be part of?
Barbara, Andrew told us at the beginning of the program that Donald Trump says that he's prepared to look very carefully at the Paris Accord and keep an open mind on this. Do you think he can be persuaded, and to what extent will domestic opposition to his policies really govern what happens in the future?
It remains to be seen whether he can be persuaded. He did say he has an open mind. I know he listens to his daughter Ivanka Trump, I think, who arranged for him to meet with Al Gore, and they said they had an open conversation about this. I think the evidence is overwhelming that it is in the United States' best interest to continue to meet its commitments, to continue to be a part of the Paris Accord. However, as you know, and as we've discussed, the people that he is nominating to his cabinet have been on record as denying that climate change even exists. So it's going to be an uphill battle. One of the things that may happen in the United States is that Trump administration tries to reduce incentives for renewable energy, subsidies for renewable energy, even though the cost of wind and solar is coming down quite dramatically. But I think that's going to be a hard sell because many of the voters for Trump in the wind and solar-rich industry states around the country benefit from these technologies, including one of the leading states on renewable energy, which is Iowa. And that's the governor of Iowa is who Trump has nominated as his new U.S. ambassador to China. So between that and, as you said, domestic opposition, groups like mine, NRDC, are going to fight at every step of the way to prevent and avoid these rollbacks of the protections that have been put in place to protect air and water and our climate, and that will continue.
Andrew, another part of the Chinese effort is to, as they put it, expand their circle of friends in developing countries to climb onto the climate change bandwagon.
Yep.
is China going to be able to do this? Is this a challenge for China?
Well, I think that China will be able to do it if they step into the leadership gap that was created by the United States. If the United States does indeed pull out of the Paris Agreement, even worse if they decide to pull out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, which is something that some members of the transition team have also opined about before taking their current jobs. At the same time, there is another side to this that I think needs to be very clear, which is that up until quite recently, the U.S. and China were in a deep disagreement about not only the question of who is going to sort of win the race on clean energy, but really what should be the appropriate role for the U.S. and China in financing coal plants around the world. And so, the fact of the matter is that China has an enormous investment, in fact, one of the biggest investors around the world in coal plants in other countries. Not doing that in China domestically anymore, but they have a huge industry that's been created around this. So there are sort of many sort of studies have been done on this. There's one that was just recently released that suggests that the coal plants built by China since 2001, if you add them all up together, that's the 8th largest emitter in the world. That's a bigger emitter than the United Kingdom, for example. And the United States was one of the countries putting enormous pressure on China to back away from that model. Now, if the Trump administration is going to back away from anything, I think we can probably make a sure bet that that's one of the things they'll stop doing, is pressuring China not to be building coal around the world. And I am quite worried about whether or not we're going to be seeing a consistent effort from the Chinese abroad, or is it going to be a two-pronged? We're going to help with some coal in some places, we're also going to help with renewable energy in other places, and I'm not really sure that in totality the world can afford that kind of effort from one of the world's biggest developers around the world.
Well, what do you make of that, Tianji? Because China is investing in other countries around the world in coal energy, but it announced, I think in September or October, that it will stop construction of dozens of coal plants inside China.
So I think there is a debate within China and within the Chinese environmental and developmental community about China's approach to coal overseas. I think there are a quite active discussion about what China's approach should be. There is a proposal that actually China should look at the carbon intensity of its portfolio overseas, energy portfolio overseas, and actually try to set up some kind of standards so that the overall carbon footprint of its overseas energy investment can be lowered, and also adding more renewable into that portfolio. So I think there is a debate going on and a discussion going on, because I think the pressure from the international community is also quite strong on China in that aspect.
Arunaba, what do you make of the future use of coal in developing countries? This is a cheaper way to go forward rather than developing clean energy technologies. Are these countries in the developing world going to be able to make that transition from coal to other forms of energy sources?
I think it will vary from country to country. For developing countries, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, primary driver of policy in this space is going to be energy access. Now, if we can deliver that through cleaner energy sources at costs of finance that are acceptable, these countries will do it, which is where I think the global collaborative effort becomes important. Even in 2030, despite China's quite aggressive targets, India will be consuming 1/3 of the coal that China will be consuming in 2030, which means that if it has to take on the mantle of climate leadership, it has to step up and do even more than what it has promised. More importantly, in the clean energy transition, it's important that China and all other major investors in this space do not adopt a mercantilist position, which means that if you just simply try to grab market share from one or the other, then we end up creating an atmosphere of trade disputes, investment disputes, that does not benefit anyone. As I said earlier, there is a global clean energy supply chain in the making, and we've got to invest our efforts in making sure that all of the countries, whether they're large emerging economies, they're developed economies, or the poorest of the poor economies, have some sort of a stake in this new climate economy. Without that, I think, and as Andrew was saying earlier, we might get to what we've promised so far, but we might not raise the ambition over and above where we are at. And that's what worries me, and whoever takes on the mantle of climate leadership, were the United States to step away from the game, would have to be cognizant of these overarching challenges.
Barbara, what should we make of the fact that Donald Trump met with the former Vice President Al Gore, whom we know is a champion of climate change? I mean, much was made of it in the media here in the United States, but are we perhaps reading too much into that?
Well, I think it's a good sign. He says he has an open mind, but like I said before, the people that he is naming to his cabinet apparently do not have an open mind. So it's really the issue here is what is the United States going to do about coal and renewables, and really what is China going to do about coal and renewables? And we were very pleased to see that the new 5-year plan for environmental protection in China includes a national cap on coal consumption of 4.2 billion tons by 2020. But we think that is not ambitious enough. We think there's a group of Chinese experts, 20 Chinese research institutes, industry experts, academics in the China Coal Cap Consumption Project. And their research has indicated that a coal cap of 3.5 billion tons for 2020 is achievable. In fact, China, its coal consumption in 2013 was 3.96 billion tons, and it has reduced its national coal consumption every year since then, including this year. So this coal consumption cap project believes that 3.5 billion tons of coal consumption in 2020 is achievable through a series of measures that would reduce China's CO2 emissions by over 800 million tons. It would also reduce the choking PM 2.5 pollution in China by 1 million tons and prevent 71,000 premature deaths from air pollution every year. So China, while it's doing tremendous things in decarbonization, it can raise its ambition pretty easily, and we think that would have tremendous implications for global climate and also for its own air pollution problem.
Tianji, on a political level, where does China go to from here? Will it continue bilateral negotiations with the United States and, of course, within the framework of the UN as well?
I think it's hard to tell, but it's worth noting that in the past 8 years, the U.S.-China climate bond, diplomatic bond, is pretty uniquely strong, and I think that's sort of instrumental to the final reach of the Paris Accord last year. So I think it would be a great loss if the U.S. and China doesn't continue on that path with this very constructive cooperation on the issue of climate change. But I think, as we have indicated before, China's climate commitment is very much rooted within its domestic context, and it's also embedded in domestic plans. So at least on the China side, I think the path towards a low-carbon economy is still going on, and a lot of the policy objectives are going to be met.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.